Hey everybody, this video is called Two Men with B Names, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Numbers, where we're going to look at the 22nd chapter, where we're going to look at Balak, who has an evil desire, and we're going to look at the false prophet of Balaam. So Numbers chapter 22, verse 1 through 4, it says, "Then the children of Israel moved and camped in the plains of Moab on the side of the Jordan across from Jericho. Now Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was exceedingly afraid of the people, because they were many. And Moab was sick with dread because of the children of Israel. So Moab said to the elders of Midian, Now this company will lick up everything around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at that time." So with their control of Transjordan secured, Israel goes on the move, not impeded, to the plains of Moab in preparation for assault and Canaan. And from verse 2 through chapter 24, many people, when they preach through the book of Numbers, you'll see that they're going to line up 22 through 24 because it's covering Balaam and Balak's encounter. But through chapter 24, the narrative changes to center on the prophet, pagan prophet Balaam. And his oracles, which oracles means prophecies, reassert the faithfulness of the Lord to the Abrahamic covenant and his purpose to bless Israel. And the Moabites were descendants of Lot, as seen back in Genesis chapter 19, verse 36-37. And Balak, their king, had seen how Israel destroyed the Amorites. And in Deuteronomy 2:9, you'll see that Balak was terrified that the same thing awaited them, as he didn't know that Israel was forbidden by God to attack Moab. And the Midianites were descendants of Abraham through Keturah, as you'll find back in Genesis 25, verse 1 through 4. And they resided south of Moab's border, and Moab communicated with them of the danger that Israel presented to them, and they joined an alliance to defeat Israel. In verse 5 and 6 says, "Then he sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor of Pethor, which is near the river in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, Look, a people has come from Egypt. See, they cover the face of the earth and are settling next to me. Therefore, please come at once, curse the people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed." So we see that Balaam was from Beth Pethor, which is a city on the Euphrates River, where the existence of a coat of prophets whose activities resembled those of Balaam had been found. And you'll learn more of his doings in the coming chapters in 24 and then later in Numbers 31. And Balaam is a false prophet that is spoken about not just here in the book of Numbers, but you're going to see him in the New Testament in the book of Deuteronomy 23, verse 3 through 6, Joshua 13:22, and Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1 through 3. And knowing that Israel was too strong to defeat through military, Balak calls for Balaam to come and curse Israel. And a curse was spoken word to bring a misfortune against the one who is spoken against. And Balak acknowledged that Balaam had the reputation of pronouncing curses that actually worked. And Balaam had the knowledge of the true God of Israel. He wasn't caught off blind. And it's unclear how he came to know the God of Israel. We just see in the text that it says so. And Balak and Balaam, when you say both the names together, it's hard. That's why the title is with two B's, the men of two B's. But verse 7 and 8, it says, So the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the diviner's fee in their hand. And they came to Balaam and spoke to him the words of Balak. And he said to them, Lodge here tonight, and I will bring you back word to you as the Lord speaks to me. So the princes of Moab stayed with Balaam. So there was a standard fee that was given for the work of a prophet in regards to fortune tellers and psychics. So today they would be the same ones that are fortune tellers or psychics as advertised. They had a standard fee back then with the false prophets as well. And throughout the chapters ahead, Balaam uses the word Lord 6 times. And in verse 18 below, he says that the Lord, my God, and he expected the God of Israel to speak to him. And as a pagan prophet, he would anticipate making contact with the gods of any people. In verse 9 through 12, then God came to Balaam and said, Who are these men to you? With you. So Balaam said to God, Balak the son of Zippor, the king of Moab, has sent me to you, saying, Look, a people has come out of Egypt, and they cover the face of the earth. Come now, curse them for me. Perhaps I shall be able to overpower them and drive them out. And God said to Balaam, You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. So we see indeed that Israel's God did communicate with Balaam. And however, rather than saying or using the term Lord, which indicates a covenant relationship, God constantly used the word God when he spoke to Balaam, as you see in verses 9 and 12, and later on in verse 20. And though Balaam called God Lord, the biblical text makes it clear that he did not have the relationship with Israel's God. And God warned Balaam to have nothing to do with these men, and God made it very clear to him as such. And Balaam couldn't curse Israel because God had determined beforehand to give them blessing only. In verse 13 through 15, So Balaam rose in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, Go back to your land, for the Lord has refused to give me permission to go with you. And the princes of Moab rose and went to Balak and said, Balaam refuses to come with us. Then Balak again sent princes more numerous and more honorable than they. So it seems that Balaam wanted to go, but God would not let him. And Balaam's reply is given to Balak's messengers, and we see there's a counter offer. In verse 16, 17, they came to Balaam and said to him, Thus says Balak the son of Zippor, Please let nothing hinder you from coming to me, for I will certainly honor you greatly, and I will do whatever you say to me. Therefore, please come, curse this people for me. So no longer did Balak's messengers carry with them the diviner's fee that you see back in verse 7. And now they brought the promise of great riches. In verse 18, 19, Then Balaam answered and said to the servants of Balak, Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of the Lord my God, to do less or more. So now therefore please you also stay here tonight, that I may know what more the Lord will say to me. So we see that Balaam entertains the offer of Balak's messengers, and he entertains the sin, as there was no need to seek God again when God made his will very clear back in verse 12. And so Balaam here is acting just like a child, and you probably had a child before that you tell them no, and then they just keep, insistent. If I ask again, maybe, dad will change their mind or mom will change their mind. In verse 21, And God came to Balaam at night and said to him, If the men come to call you, rise and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you, that you shall do. So Balaam rose in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the princes of Moab. So because of the great desire for material wealth that would come to him, Balaam desired to go to Balak, and he implored the Lord even after he was told not to go. And God accepted, though, Balaam's request to let him go, but he told him that he could only speak from the true word of God. And God did not change his will here. So get it straight that God did not change his will. God didn't give in to a man, but God declared his will, and then Balaam rejected it. And, just as the lost world, that God leaves them over to themselves. And sometimes, when we disobey God and, we want to do our own will, God will let you go that route, but there's going to be consequences. And God says yes sometimes to the desire of the wicked because he will judge them. And he revealed the wickedness of Balaam's heart through this. In verse 22 through 27 says, "Then God's anger was aroused because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in a way as an adversary against him. And he was riding on his donkey, and 2 servants were with him. Now the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And the donkey turned aside out of the way and went into the field. So Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back onto the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood on the narrow path between the vineyards, with a wall on this side and a wall on that side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed herself against the wall and crushed Balaam's foot against the wall. So he struck her again. Then the angel of the Lord went further and stood in the narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. So Balaam's anger was aroused, and he struck the donkey with his staff." So we see that God's wrath here burns against Balaam because God knew that Balaam wasn't submissive to what he required. And God's confrontation with Balaam was a reaffirmation of the word that he gave him back in verse 20 and later in verse 35, that he was only to speak the words of God that God wanted him to speak. And the angel of the Lord, as we know from our study in the book of Exodus, the angel of the Lord is a manifestation of the presence of the reincarnate Jesus Christ. And you can see that across Genesis as well in Exodus 3. And the donkey was more spiritually perceptive than the prophet. And the donkey had no spiritual gifts, but acknowledged his creator. And, that's amazing to think about, that a donkey, acknowledged God, but this man would not. In verse 28 through 30 says, "Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, 'What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?' And Balaam said to the donkey, 'Because you have abused me, I wish there was a sword in my hand, for now I would kill you.' So the donkey said to Balaam, 'Am I not your donkey on which you have ridden ever since I became yours to this day? Was I ever disposed to do this to you?' And he said, 'No.' So Balaam's donkey was able to see the angel of the Lord with his drawn sword. And realizing the danger to herself, we see that she sought to avoid the angel. And in doing this, she preserves Balaam as well. And we see a miracle here where this donkey is able to communicate with Balaam. And she rebukes him for his ungodly punishment, his anger, and reactions toward her. And Balaam was so angry and frustrated that he responded without hesitation. Here's this donkey speaking to him, and he's not even seeing that this isn't part of the norm. I mean, this donkey has never spoken before. And we see that the donkey rebukes him, and we see that he isn't even impressed with a donkey carrying on an intellectual conversation, not just saying a word like a parrot, but this donkey was carrying a conversation as if the donkey was another human being. And so Balaam, he tells the donkey that I will kill you. And what cruel words from a prophet. You know, the PETA would smack the stupid out of him for this. But he admits, though, that the donkey got the best of him in his conversation because he acted out of anger. He doesn't have self-control. And he's given the red flag that maybe if the donkey hasn't acted the way that the donkey has acted before, there might just be a reason behind it. He's not catching the unique experience here of what's happening. In verse 31 through 33, and the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed his head and fell flat on his face. And the angel of the Lord said to him, why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to stand against you because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely I would also have killed you by now and let her live. So we see that God is opening Balaam's eyes here to see the things in reality, what was really happening, and especially those things that were not ordinary visible to humans. And God is calling him to be submissive to his will as he went to Balak. And the angel of the Lord rebukes Balaam for his mistreatment of the donkey. So we see that even, treating animals right is important to God. And the angel of the Lord, as I mentioned, I believe is Jesus pre-incarnation before Jesus came down and, was born through the Virgin Mary. In verse 34, 35, and Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned, for I did not know you stood in the way against me. Now therefore, if it displeases you, I will turn back. Then the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, go with the men, but only the word that I speak to you, that you shall speak. So Balaam went with the princes of Balak. So picture yourself here as in Balaam's shoes, and be thankful you're not in Balaam's shoes, hopefully. But you would probably want to confess your faults and humble yourself. And Balaam here, he seems to be questioning if he was displeasing God. He wasn't confessing that he was displeasing God, but God made it clear to him many times before. But we see that he continues to pursue the things that he wanted as an answer from God. And Balaam did not want what God had already revealed. And in response to Balaam's hardened heart, we see that God gave him over to his own sinful desire, as mentioned. And God didn't change his mind, but God sent him on the path to judgment. In verse 36 through 41, says, now when Balak heard that Balaam was coming, he went out to meet him at the city of Moab, which is on the border of Arnon, the boundary of the territory. Then Balak said to Balaam, did I not earnestly send to you, calling for you? Why did you not come to me? Am I not able to honor you? And Balaam said to Balak, look, I have come to you. Now have I any power at all to say anything? The word that God puts in my mouth that I must speak. So Balaam went with Balak, and they came to Kirjath Huzoth. Then Balak offered oxen and sheep, and he sent some to Balaam and to the princes who were with him. So it was the next day that Balak took Balaam and brought him up to the high places of Baal, that from there he might observe the extent of the people. So we see the chapter here wraps up with Balaam meeting with Balak to greet him. And after a bit of sacrifice, Balak then called Balaam to do what he had hired him to do. And his purpose was to get Balaam to curse Israel and rob them of their spiritual strength, so that Israel would be easier to defeat in battle. And Balaam says it is not in his control, and he's pretty much saying that to protect himself in the case that he failed, he would go on to blame God for it. So to wrap up, we looked at Balak, who was king of Moab, fair and advancing Israel. And we see that Balak invites Balaam to curse Israel. We see Balak sent men to hire Balaam's services as a prophet. We see the character of Balaam as he had a heart of stone, that he was not genuine to God. And we see that Balaam had a love for money that you'll see in the New Testament. We'll go over a couple of those passages. And we see God's response to Balaam and Balaam's reply to Balak's messengers, and we see a counter offer made. And they increased the offer, and Balaam was entertained. And Balaam entertained him. And God gave Balaam over to himself and his wicked desires. And then we see the cool confrontation where the angel of the Lord, Jesus Christ, is speaking through this donkey. And God, is giving Balaam a message, and Balaam is so oblivious that he's not even getting the drift of what's happening around him. And Balaam even got to see the angel of the Lord. And the reason why I argue that, and many others, that the angel of the Lord is Jesus Christ, is because in John 1:18 it says that no one has seen the Father. And we see Balaam's inadequate repentance and sinful course, and we see that he met a second time with Balak as the chapter ends. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 15 and 16, it says here, they have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. But he was rebuked for his iniquity. A dumb donkey speaking with a man's voice restrained the madness of the prophet. So Balaam is just one example of a false prophet from the Old Testament. In these verses, they expose his heart for having a love of money. And what it came down ultimately to is that Balaam was the donkey. He was, he was dumb. In Jude verse 11, book right before Revelation, standalone chapter in this book, Jude 11, it says, "Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, have run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korah." So we see that the love of money was the root of Balaam's heart. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, it says here, "But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold to the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality." And Balaam is referred to as a false teacher in the book of Jude. And here in the Lord's rebuke to the church of Pergamum, we see that Satan's tactics haven't really changed between Balaam and today. And he will do whatever he wants, whatever he can, to bring idolatry and sexual immorality and temptation and false prophets and teachers. And these false teachers and all that, and false prophets, they will fall for these sins. And today, there are many Balaams out there in the ministry behind pulpits. They're there for the money. They're there, to be compromisers. And then, they live immoral lives. You see them get caught up in sexual, impurity or whatever case. And you know, these people, they are out there prophesying that all is well, that God is happy. You know, this is going to be the year of blessings, and this is going to be the best year ever. You know, they always want to give what the itching ears in 2 Timothy want to hear. So that's going to wrap up this video, and we'll see you tomorrow as we're going to look at a topical video. So have a great weekend ahead. God bless.